Okay, I'm going to go through some approaches to summarizing foraging data from a data table, from a spreadsheet into something that's a data table that you might see in a scientific report. And so I have this flat file of foraging data that's was collected on the island of Borneo. And there's a lot of fields here, but what's important to know is each row in this data set is an individual foraging observation of a bird. And the observers went through as they encountered birds. They walked along transects as they encountered birds. They would observe the bird until it attempted to eat some type of food item. And they would record a specific set of information. As soon as the bird made a foraging attempt, they might note if it was successful or not. They would move on and observe another bird. Okay, so that they were making different observations of different individuals. And so this is a very similar method to what you'll be making a data table for. So we're going to look at how we'd summarize it. This large spreadsheet, it's really hard to see any kind of patterns. So we want our data tables to be in a format where you can look at the numbers that are in the data table and make some comparisons. So the first thing we're going to do is go into the pivot table option. I'm going to highlight the entire data set, click Insert, Pivot Table. And now we have a pivot table format ready to go. For this kind of data set, it generally makes sense to have species be the rows in your data set, and then you'll be scanning down to compare among species for the different parameters. Or if you're looking within a species, you'll be scanning across to your columns to see the different ways in which they were using their environment. So we're going to let species be the rows this time in the data set. And then we're going to slowly build a table. We're going to have to go reuse this pivot table template here, our analysis tool, multiple times to generate what we want to see as our data table. But here we have species. There are different kinds of data that are collected when you're making foraging observations. Some of the data that are collected are character data or state data. And so you're noting the type of behavior the bird's engaging in when it's trying to attempt to eat. That's called the attack maneuver. And you might have observed birds doing 10 different kinds of attack maneuvers across the observations that you made. There are also continuous or numeric types of data like foliage density or the height of the bird above ground. And so those are going to be summarized in a slightly different way. And so we're going to start with the numeric data because it's generally the quickest to summarize. Okay, so here we have our species. Let's start with, how about foliage density? So this is described in the paper that's really the reference for this entire data set, Rimpson and Robinson, 1990. And it describes all of these different ways to collect observational data on foraging and a standardized use of terminology for these different metrics. So here's foliage density. In Rimpson and Robinson, this is described as a scale between 0 and 5, with 0 being absolutely no foliage around the bird, and 5 being very thick foliage. And so, and it mentions if you envision a circle or a sphere around the bird, that's 1 meter in radius. So think of that. That's about 6 feet diameter, a very large hoop or something that you might even step through. You put that imaginary hoop around the bird with the bird at center and estimate the foliage density. And so let's summarize that in our values in the pivot table. And so what we first get when we put that into the values is the counts. That's just how many cells of these different species that we got foliage density estimates for. And so we really want to change that to be an average value. On average, across all the observations, what were the estimates of foliage density? And here they are for the samples that we collected. And so you can see for some we have these average values. Like for this is a bird type of bird called a bulbul. It was like about 50%, at least from these summaries that we're observing. It was observed about 50% foliage density of 2.5 ranking on average. And so you can look through and see some birds did not seem to have thick foliage density around them. Of course, they may have been just one observation, and some birds seem to have thicker average foliage density. Okay, so we have that metric now. And so this is how I slowly build a table from these data. I copy it and I'm going to paste it into a new worksheet because this pivot table is going to expand and contract as I look at different variables. So I'm pasting that information as values. I'm going to insert a row on top. And I'm going to label each column in the data set as I go. So this is species. This is foliage density. Average. I think as I look at this, it would be useful to also know the standard deviation of foliage density. And so if I actually were to look at value field settings again, the same chart, and put in standard deviation, oh, okay, I see. A lot of my species in my data set have only one observation. So I can copy these data as well over. And I start to see these divide by zeros. But what I would actually do at this point is I would start to build a modified data table. And so I would start to remove species, or I probably wouldn't start to do this just yet, but you could start to remove species that had such a small sample size that you can't calculate a standard deviation. The other option for this kind of table, if you want to present all the information, then in this case, you may or may not calculate standard deviation, but what's useful to know as our first sort of piece of information would be our sample size. And so if we go into, I think it would make sense to drag this out, and actually for every species in the list, I'm actually going to place species into this values. So, and it's listed as the count. And so all this is telling me is how many times did I make an observation of this species in the data set. And that is my sample size. And so I'm going to copy that and put that information, into the data set. I'm always pasting as values. It usually works to just copy paste from a pivot table, but I'm always careful to paste just values whenever I'm pasting anything from Excel that I've calculated. So this is sample size. This is just telling me how many observations I made of each one of these species in the list. And so I'm going to call this, yeah, here we go, average. I'm going to call this mean. And I'm going to also, I'll start to talk about making this table look a little bit nicer here in just a minute. And so for these birds that have, well, this one has a standard deviation, has a sample size of 4, but a standard deviation of 0. So maybe the foliage density was just very consistent among those 4 observations. And then here we have a number of birds where you're getting the divide by 0 error. And these are birds that were only observed once. You can't get a standard deviation if you observe a bird once. And so this helps us if you're going to not include these estimates of variation in your data set, there at least needs to be some representation of sample size. Looks like there was one bird that was observed many times, well, not many times, only 22 times, but out of all the observations in the data set, it was observed most frequently. And so we could actually start to get some approaching some knowledge about how dense of vegetation this bird likes, seems to like kind of dense vegetation. So that is a numeric metric data point. You could do the same with, let's say, height, because we're estimating height above ground. Oops, let's plot that into values and make sure that we have that set at the average. So this is giving us average foraging height of these birds in meters. Okay. So I'm going to put this also into my data table. Oops, I got to copy it. Paste it. Okay, so I've added some continuous variables to my data set. Now, what about the character state data? Well, let's go back and look. Say I want to look at the different attack maneuvers that a bird was using. So I'm going to remove the height, and I'm going to go into attack maneuver. Well, all this does is count the number of cells where I've said that there was an attack maneuver. So I need to make sure attack maneuver is also consisting of multiple columns. So we have a column for each type of attack maneuver that was documented in this data set. Okay, some attack maneuvers were really common, others were not so common. But what we get is across each row, we get these frequencies. Okay, and so you could, in your data set, put these attack maneuvers into the data as is, or you could represent them as frequencies, as percentages. And so I'm going to copy these data. I'm going to copy the grand totals as well, just in case I want to do percentages. So I'm taking those data and then I'm putting them into the table. You can see this is a really big table. And so what you may end up doing is lumping certain types of attack maneuvers as other, or the other option is to start to pare down your data set. I think when you're initially describing what you're observing, it's okay to have these different attack maneuvers up, but you can actually start to minimize or change the column sizes so that the table is something that can be read across a regular sheet of paper. Now, if you wanted to calculate percentages, you could simply do that by taking the number that's in each cell, so only focusing on the cells that have numbers, and then dividing by the grand total, column total, okay? And so, for example, that first row had 4 observations and 2 were reach down and 2 were glean. This was a type of little insectivorous canopy bird called a green eora. So 50% gleaned and 50% did what we call reach down. It's a specific type of maneuver where the bird's plucking something from a surface, but it's engaging in a certain type of posture to do that. And so we could do that. The frequencies are also okay. And again, it's always important here, if you're going to summarize the data like as in percentages, it makes sense to have that the observer always, the reader of the table always knows what your sample size is. Because if I say this bird spent 50% of its time gleaning and 50% of its time reaching, somebody might think, oh, well, this tells us a lot about this bird, but actually that was across a total of 4 observations. So it's always important to have that information in there. So that's how you would summarize the data. You would find the different character state variables as well as the numeric variables that you want to express in the table. I think foraging height, foliage density, perhaps height above, distance from the canopy, the height of the substrate the bird is on. These are all numeric types of data that can be summarized in a table. And then attack maneuver, vertical position, those might be some other types of qualitative data that you would want to summarize. Now that I have the data in my table like I want it, I have to make some decisions about how I want to represent it. First of all, do I want to include every species in here, or do I only want to include species that I observed more than a certain number of times? For the purposes of an assignment where there's only something like a handful to 30 observations of birds, I would include a complete summary. And so let's do that for this data table. I'm going to include a complete summary, and instead of expressing standard deviation as some kind of metric of variation, I'm reporting my sample size. So make sure you report your sample size. Here's foliage density. So one thing I'm noticing as I look down is there's these fractions that are being expressed out to many significant digits. And so what I want to do is make these data appear uniform, and I'm going to do that by having only a certain number of significant digits expressed, only one. And so I'm going to express it into the 10th place. For most of these birds, there aren't a lot of foraging observations, so these significant digits are not really depicting anything of significance. So I'm going to highlight these numeric columns of data. I'm going to go into Format Cells. So I did that by, I highlighted the data and then I right-clicked and Format Cells became an option. And I'm going to select, so the first tab here is number. I'm going to select number and 1 decimal place. And then I'm going to select OK. And so now the data are summarized out to the 10th place. Okay. I can start to also compress or condense these cells. These are all cells that are expressing numeric data. They don't take up a lot of space. And so I can make these columns really narrow. The only downside here, I'm going to boldface these headers, is that I can't read the column headers. So there's a couple of things I can do. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click again on these selected cells and go into Format Cells. And I'm going to go to the second tab, Alignment, and I'm going to select Wrap Text. This will allow text to appear below, not along a single plane of axis, single axis in the data set. It will let it wrap around and down, and it will expand these cells that it's in. So you'll see what I do when I select OK. This is what happens. Okay, well, that looks kind of messy. So I can reduce the size of my font so that it fits better, or I can just adjust the column widths just enough to make it easier to read. Okay, and I might make this one a little bit bigger. Okay, so now we have these multiple columns that are all representing these different attack maneuvers. Okay, so you can summarize them as well, or you can make these much smaller and wrap the text in here as well. So I'm going to format the cells. I'm going to wrap text. I'm going to select OK, and then I'm going to, as these all of these columns are highlighted, I'm going to take my cursor here until it appears like a divider and move these this column to a much narrower size, and all columns that are selected will become the same size as that column. And so that's a great start. And then I will one by one sort of widen the columns as needed. And so I tend to, that's supposed to be hang down. See, I'm correcting some of my typos here. And so there's these different, you can sort to adjust these column headers in a way that they're readable, okay, but they're condensed enough to put down into a data table. Now for a data set with 30 individual observations of birds foraging, you're unlikely to have this many different columns, so hopefully the sheet will be smaller anyway. I'm going to delete these end columns here, and I'm going to also boldface my column titles. Now, the last thing I want to do is there's a couple things I'd like to do. I might want to make all of my cells be formatted so that they have a border. I might do that with the data set. I think for a larger table, that makes a lot of sense. For tables in publications, this is often how they're formatted. The headers are formatted with a top and a bottom border, like this. And then there's a bottom border. let's do a thick bottom border. Okay, and so we get these borders here. It makes sense also for these data to be expressed in the center of the cells. It tends to make it easier to scan across the table. There's just these little changes you can make to data tables to make them easier to read. So I just selected the cells with data in them, and I selected this option up here, center your content. And then, let's see what else I might do. I would do a print preview of my table just to see what it looks like. Oh, and I would insert actually another layer up here, probably, and merge that. So I would probably, starting with the very first attack maneuver, I would have this overarching category of attack maneuver listed here. And what I would do is I would indicate that that broader category of attack maneuver is occurring over this range of cells. And you can merge cells here. So if I select this option to merge, attack maneuver now appears above the others. And I can boldface it, and I can also put brackets, like I could put side borders here if I thought that would be the best way to express it. Let's see if I can do more borders. Sometimes the side borders show up. And so I'm gonna have a border show up. There's a border here and here. And okay. So now I have these side borders, and I might even have some lines connecting to them to show that this is a span, a range of data. The next thing I'm going to do is print, and I'm not actually going to print, but I'm going to do a print preview of my data table. That will help me see what the data will look like, and I can shrink it, I can expand it, I can see some things about how Excel's reading this data in this print preview. You can also go into view print preview to see things this way as well. So I'm just selecting the printer that I have here because it sort of adjusts the way things appear, and because I'm not connected right now to the other printer, it makes things a bit clunky because it's looking for it. So I'm going to put this table into landscape orientation, for example, because this is such a large data table. I would want it in landscape. I would want really narrow margins to fit in as much data as possible. And I can see this thing about attack maneuver. We can actually also scale. We can scale the data until we can say fit it to one sheet and see what happens. Okay, so it's fitting it to one sheet. And so I can start to see the ways I'd need to adjust the data to make it fit onto one sheet and look okay. I think I would want to reduce the font size of these, of many of the, maybe not the numbers, but certainly of the text in the data table so that it showed up properly. And I would want to adjust these brackets as well. So I think what I would do is I'd go back, and for the side brackets, I would actually just have this be a cell outline. Like that. So let's go back into preview. Oops. So I'm going to select that, and then I'll select top border. Okay. That should fix it. I can go back. It's still not looking like it's going to work that way. So I have to fiddle with that a little bit. Border. So automatic border. We have all sides surrounded here. Make sure I've got that selected. Okay. And so we do that tweaking and adjusting to make sure our table looks the way we want it to look. And so the goal is to basically have a table that can be fit onto a single sheet of paper that can be in landscape or portrait or landscape orientation, and basically includes a summary of the data that you collected. All right.